Good morning and welcome to session 16 of Understanding LDS History, where we are working our way slowly but surely through the history of the church from 1844 to 1877 together. And before we dive in this morning, I wanted to share with you one of the reasons I think this class is important, and I hope that it's helpful. One of the LDS forums that I'm on online, it's just a group for LDS people to ask questions back and forth to each other. And one church member had asked this question this week that I thought said so much about the differences between our beliefs. And you hear a lot today that, well, we all believe the same thing. We all believe in Jesus, right? And all that really matters is we believe in Jesus. But the differences are very important. And I thought this post was heartbreaking in a way. This was a church member asking other church members, do you believe Judgment Day is final? Specifically, if I only qualify for the terrestrial kingdom, which is a heartbreaking word for me, right? Because you have to qualify in their theology. If I only qualify for the terrestrial kingdom, am I stuck there for all eternity? Most of what I read in LDS literature says yes. If that's true, I wonder if I'm in the terrestrial kingdom and say 500 years later, I now meet the requirements, which is another heartbreaking word. So 500 years later, I now meet the requirements for the celestial kingdom. Is it a timed test? Does God say, well, you do qualify, but it's too late, and now you're stuck there for all of eternity? And so he's working through the Mormon idea, the theology of eternal progression. And right, and is it a time? It's a good question. Is it a time test? If I progress in the next life to the terrestrial kingdom, am I stuck there forever? Can I somehow still progress? One of the big gulfs that separates us theology-wise is in Christian theology. And if you're LDS watching this online, this is what we want you to understand in this class is you don't meet the requirements, and you never will. And none of us are good enough, no matter how hard we try. And that's why the gospel is such good news. We don't meet the requirements. We don't measure up. And Jesus forgives us and redeems us anyway. And we can never earn it. And so despite all of those differences, if you're LDS and you're in here or you're LDS and watching online, we want you to know what good news the gospel really is and what good news the atonement of Jesus really is. And so I hope as we work through these classes that I can share that good news in a way that even though we differ a great deal in a lot of places of theology, we can differ and do so in a way, do it with gentleness and respect. I hope my speech always lives up to the command of Scripture that I want my speech to be gracious, even when we differ. So with that in mind, we'll dive in today. We left off last week. I believe we left off last week. The saints had made it all the way to Fort Laramie in modern-day Wyoming territory at the time, and they crossed the Platte River there. And this is the initial vanguard group that Brigham Young was bringing across. They made it there. And they crossed the river, and for the first time in the whole trip, now they are officially on the Oregon Trail. They had been taking a northern route. They dropped down. They got part of the Oregon Trail proper from that point. And that's when it started to get hard for the first time. Because if you've been through Nebraska, not a lot of hills and mountains and valleys to cross. Coming across Nebraska, but it got a whole lot rockier once they got to Wyoming. And Orson Pratt said, we think we're earning our road tax. Because every day we send out a crew of 10 or 12 people who have to go ahead with spades and shovels and iron bars just to get the road passable. You can see too on here, Fort Laramie is quite a bit farther north than modern day Laramie. It's right about there. So it was a lot more northerly than where current day Laramie would be as they work their way across. So they start going uphill from Fort Laramie for the first time, and it started getting tough, and hard to keep going even in the right direction. And Appleton Harmon lamented that fact, that we have to change direction every few minutes to wind around some point or gutter, to pass some creek or confuse mass of rocks which lay in fragments, or to avoid some sort of hill. And at one point we're going northeast when we're going to actually be going southwest. And so it was difficult sledding there for a while. A few days later they had to cross the the Platte River. And I looked as best I could. I mentioned last week they were carrying a boat with them that they named the Revenue Cutter. It was a little leather boat of some kind that they could carry, and when it wasn't being used, it could be used as the bed of a wagon. And they would use that at all of these stream crossings. A full wagon is a whole lot harder to move, get across a river than an empty wagon. So all of these river crossings, they would ferry, right? They would take the Revenue Cutter back and forth with all of their supplies so they could bring the wagons over unloaded. And I desperately wanted to know what the Revenue Cutter looked like. And I could not find a picture or a description or anything of it. There might be one out there, but I didn't locate it. So they got all of their things across, and Brigham Young very smartly, right? They're not the only people on the trail. 4,000 people were across the Oregon Trail that summer. And so Brigham wisely left some guys behind to charge Oregon-bound immigrants to use the Revenue Cutter to ferry their supplies back and forth across. And so the immigrants that were pushing right behind them paid $1.50 each per wagon load to ferry their supplies over, and they paid it in flour. Payment being made in flour at $2.50 per 100 pounds. Now, I don't know, that seemed like a pretty good deal. I know inflation, I don't know how big the bags are you buy at the grocery store now, but $2.50 for 100 pounds of flour at a time when they desperately needed it. And it's amazing to me those people behind them had that much flour that they could sell them that much. But Wilford Woodruff commented, "It looked as much of a miracle to me to see our flour in meal bags replenished in the midst of the Black Hills as it did to have the children of Israel fed with manna in the wilderness." And so they were able to replenish their supplies by charging the other immigrants, which they would do again not long later. Because a few days later, they had head across the North Platte River again near modern-day Casper, Wyoming. And the difficulty here was, at that point, it was 100 feet wide and 15 feet deep. So how on earth are we going to get across? And Brigham at first said, well, we can just tie 4 wagons together and pull them across. Empty wagons after they'd ferried their supplies. That's what they tried. It didn't go well. It was so wide and so deep, and the current was so strong there that it just washed the wagons downstream. I won't read this whole quote, but it would just wash them downstream and end up flipping them. That didn't go good, and so then they tried to build a little raft to get it across that way, but with pulling it on a rope, pulling the raft across. But again, the current was so strong, it would grab the rope and it'd just pull the whole thing under. And you can try to imagine, we take bridges so for granted today. If you just try to imagine everywhere you went, if you're in a wagon, what a huge obstacle any river is. But especially one that's this big and this deep. And this picture's from a pioneer group in 1855 where it was much shallower, but you can still see that's quite a chore. And so how are they going to get across? So Brigham finally, he had sent guys to cut timber. And so they had finally come back with enough timber. And it was recorded that President Young stripped himself and went to work with all his strength, assisted by the doctor, Willard Richards, and the brethren, and they made a first-rate white pine and white cotton raft big enough to load a wagon on top of. And that new raft was in operation all day and worked well. So they were able to use that to bring one wagon across at a time. And if you go to Casper, Wyoming today, you can still see a replica of that wagon they used. And then again, Brigham very smartly left a group behind to charge the next group coming behind them to use this new raft that they had just built. And so they got paid, which they desperately needed the money, but they also got to stick it to the hated Missourians, who were the ones coming up behind them. And there was no love lost between them. And so he didn't mind charging them at all. Well, not long after they left Casper, they crossed the Continental Divide in Wyoming. And I don't know about you, but when I picture crossing the Continental Divide, I picture crossing the peak of some big mountain, right? I'm going up this way and now I'm going to go down the other way. But if you cross it there in Wyoming, it's not that impressive. But the monument to the old Oregon Trail is still there today, where they crossed over the Continental Divide. Not long after that, on June 21st, they made camp near Independence Rock, which is still a famous landmark even today. This big rock sticking up in the middle of the prairie. It's still well known today because even then all these wagon trains and people going by were carving their names into the rock. So you can still go today and see the names of pioneers like I.J. Hughes, who passed in 1850. In this picture, somebody named Lewis. So this is when my ancestors initially came in 1858. Just kidding, no relation. I'm first generation immigrant to the area. But pretty neat, you can still go by and visit that site today. On June 23rd, they finally got their first sight of the Rockies. Horace Whitney recorded it this way. He said, "In advance of us, at a great distance, can be seen the outlines of mountains, loftier than any we have yet seen, the settling sun throwing its glancing rays athwart their summits, revealing them to our eyes covered with snow." And late in June, they ran into two very famous people. Two famous frontiersmen, mountain men, Jim Bridger and Moses Harris. And in just a matter of a couple days, they ran into both of them. You might not be familiar with Moses Harris, but you probably at least have heard the name of Jim Bridger, who was maybe the most well-known mountain man in the time. But both of them had been living in the area in the West for 30 years at this point and knew the area as well as any human beings alive. But they gave Brigham conflicting reports on where they should go. After meeting with Harris, he tried to steer them to the Bear River, to the Cache Valley, so the Logan area. He's like, that is sweet up there. That's probably where you guys should go. Bridger favored the area farther south between Utah Lake and the Great Salt Lake, where Salt Lake City is today. Probably in part because that would take them past his fort, and they can maybe do some trade while he was there. But he steered them towards Salt Lake City, and which by then Young had already pretty much made up his mind that that's where they were going. And he ultimately chose the Salt Lake area. He did caution them, though. He's like, before you start bringing a lot of people out there, I've been there, I don't know if you can raise crops there. And you better make sure you can farm it before you start bringing thousands of people out this way. And Woodruff recorded him as saying that Bridger said he would give $1,000 for a bushel of corn raised in the basin in Salt Lake area. I don't know, are there any gardeners in here? I'm not. But I've had one on and off since we lived in Utah, but I've never done well with corn. I've never been able to get more than a couple scraggly ears of corn in the growing season that we have here. And so Bridger had his doubts about their ability to farm it. Not everybody was impressed by the famous Jim Bridger. Howard Egan said, from his appearance and conversation, I wouldn't take him to be a man of truth. And Woodruff said, we found him to have been a great traveler and possessed a great knowledge of nearly all of Oregon and California, which was this was not known as Utah at the time, this whole area. He knows all about the area if what he told us was true. Woodruff kind of thought he seems like he's kind of full of hot air and full of himself. And from a lot of accounts, Bridger kind of was. Then on June 29th, you might remember if you were here last week, they ran into this guy. Do you remember Samuel Brannan we talked about last week was the one who took the group of 250 pioneers from New York all the way around South America, and they had settled in San Francisco. And that spring, Brandon had set out from San Francisco, come all the way through the Sierra Nevada, all the area they're getting ready to go, traveled all the way from California to meet them. And he was not impressed by the area he had come across. Nevada and Utah didn't impress him at all. And so he tried to convince Brigham, hey man, you guys need to keep going. California is nice. Again, to quote the Beverly Hillbillies, that's the place you ought to be. And he tried to convince Brigham to keep going and to bring everybody through all the way to California. But Brigham remained intent on the Great Basin. And Samuel didn't stay with the group. He left and went to Pueblo, Colorado, where he hooked up with some members of the Mormon battalion who were making their way back to California. So finally, by early June, they arrived at the famous Fort Bridger. Anybody here ever visited Fort Bridger in Wyoming? It's about as impressive now as it was then. It's an interesting place to go, but it's not one of those tourist places you go, wow, this was worth a whole vacation. But it wasn't impressive even then, but it was famous. And a very well-known stopping point for wagon trains going through. If you think about the route they've taken, they've gone all the way across Nebraska and Wyoming. There are no towns and no cities, and there's nothing since Fort Laramie, way back in eastern Wyoming. So there weren't many trading posts or places. And so Fort Bridger was very well known for a few years, about 20 years, in the late 19th century. But William Clayton didn't think it was much of a fort. He said it was just made up of 2 double log houses about 40 feet long, joined by a pen for horses, about 10 feet high in construction, which is all the appearance of a fort in sight. So it wasn't a lot, but it was an important stopping off point that's become famous even till today. From our standpoint as residents of Weber County, it was a few days later that they met somebody that's very significant in our history. A few days later, they met a trapper by the name of Miles Goodyear, who had just established a trading post on the banks of the Weber River that we call Fort Buenaventura today. And he had built it in 1846, so just the year before. And it wasn't where Fort Buenaventura is today. My best understanding, it would have been just east of the river where 28th Street is today, where he had originally built it. But that's a replica of his cabin. And he tried to convince them that, hey, your route you need to take into Utah, you need to take the Weber Canyon route in. That is the best route to take. And he had probably ulterior motives, because he had a trading post at the end of that route. And he knew if they go through here, it's going to create a road, and more people might go through this way, and they might stop at my trading post that I just built. So he was trying to drive traffic his direction. And Brigham chose to ultimately not go that way. But they would very quickly, before 1847 was over, they would force Miles Goodyear out. It was kind of you're going to sell us your trading post or else. We'll get to that. But the Mormons would buy him out before 1847 was over and established the city of Ogden. But Goodyear went on to a few other ventures. He died in the Sierra Nevadas at the age of 32. So, which was a few years later. That's what blows my mind in this. We talk about stunted adolescence and stuff today. He's out there building trading posts in the middle of the wilderness, and he's in his mid-20s, right? That's quite a lot of gumption. All right, moving on. By mid-July, a lot of people in the party began to get really sick with what they called Rocky Mountain fever. And we think today it was probably Colorado tick fever, but they blamed it on altitude and all the dust, and they weren't sure what caused it, but they knew they were getting sick. And several in the party got really sick. And among them, Brigham Young, by July 12th, was so sick he was insensible and raving. out of his mind. He had to be left behind while they moved on without him. And you don't hear this part of the story a lot, but basically for the next 10 days, Heber Kimball was making the decisions there towards the end of the trip because Brigham was so sick he just wasn't able to. By the 15th, he felt well enough to join up with the main camp. That wouldn't last. But he sent an advance group ahead, led by Orson Pratt with 23 wagons, to scout the terrain and prepare the road for their final descent down into the Salt Lake Valley. But by the 17th, Brigham was again so sick, they thought he wasn't going to make it. A lot of them thought he was going to die. They had a special prayer meeting for him. He improved a little. And by the 20th, he was well enough to move, but they made a bed for him in the back of Wilford Woodruff's wagon. And he wasn't even healthy enough to get out of bed at that point. And so he's lagging behind the rest of the group. So it was actually on July 20th that Orson Pratt's advance company finally made their way down into the Salt Lake Valley for the very first time. And so the first pioneers didn't get here on July 24th. They got here on July 20th. And Orson recorded his first view of their new home that day. He said, "Mr. Snow and myself ascended this hill, big mountain, we would call it today, from the top of which a broad open valley, about 20 miles wide and 30 miles long, lay stretched out before us, at the north end of which was the broad waters of the Great Salt Lake glistening in the sunbeams, containing high mountainous islands from 25 to 35 miles in extent. After issuing from the mountains among which we had been shut up for many days, and beholding in a moment such an extensive scenery open before us, we couldn't refrain from a shout of joy, which almost involuntarily escaped from our lips the moment this grand and lovely scene was within our view." And I guess so. After a trip that long, I'd probably be a little excited too. That evening, while they're sitting around the fire, Pratt got a letter from Willard Richards that contained instructions from Brigham Young about what they were supposed to do while they're waiting for everybody else to get there. And these were Brigham's instructions to Pratt's group, that advanced group. It said, "President Young felt inclined for the present not to crowd upon the Utes until we have a chance to get acquainted with them, and that it would be better to bear toward the region of the Salt Lake rather than the Utah Lake down in the Provo area. Find some good place for our seeds and deposit them as speedily as possible, regardless of a future location. Get crops in the ground. To prosecute the route as you have hitherto done until you arrive at some point in the basin where you could hear the potatoes grow if they only happened to have been there." When you think about it, July 20th is very late in the growing season. And if they were going to have anything to eat to last them through the winter, they were very concerned about, we got to get stuff in the ground like today. Like right away, get busy planting. That was their main concern. The time for planting is fully come, and we feel anxious to make every move that we could to facilitate the potato crop. It matters not where it is. The President thinks the Utes may feel a little tenacious about their choice lands on the Utah Lake, so we better keep further north towards the Salt Lake, which is more of a warlike or neutral ground, and by doing so, we should be less likely to be disturbed. So they got busy. The main group arrived in the valley on the evening of July 22nd. And Thomas Bullock described it this way: "The sky is clear, the air is delightful, and altogether looks glorious. The only drawback appearing to be the absence of timber. But there's an ocean of stone in the mountains to build stone houses and walls for fencing. If we can only find a bed of coal, we can do well and be hidden up in the mountains under the Lord." He thought it was great. Not everybody was impressed as these first couple with their first view of the Salt Lake Valley. Among them were Brigham's brother Lorenzo, and you remember his wife Harriet was one of the three women that were with them. Her reaction to seeing the Salt Lake Valley for the first time was this. Harriet said, "We've traveled 1,500 miles to get here, and I would willingly travel 1,000 miles farther to get where it looked like a white man could live. Lorenzo said, "This day we arrived in the valley of the Great Salt Lake, and my feelings were such as I cannot describe. Everything looked gloomy, and I felt heartsick." So some people's reaction were, this is it. This is home. Not everybody was as equally elated. All right, long story short, Brigham didn't get his first view because he's still trailing behind the rest of the group until the evening of July 23rd from the top of Big Mountain, where he gave this account. "When on its summit, I directed Elder Woodruff, who had kindly tendered me the use of his carriage, to turn it halfway around so that I could have a view of the portion of Salt Lake from my bed in the back. The Spirit of light rested upon me and hovered over the valley, and I felt there that the saints would find protection and safety." And so it wasn't until July 24th that Brigham and that rear group finally made their way into the Salt Lake Valley. And that's why, if you're all of us in here, this may not be the case if you're watching online, July 24th is a big deal for us in Utah because we celebrate the arrival of the pioneers. But it's actually, that was the day that Brigham arrived. They had already been there for a couple days. And the most impressive part of the whole story to me is this, that when Brigham got there, less than 4 days later, they had already dug irrigation trenches, planted potatoes and corn seeds, and prepared a turnip patch. That little advance group had gotten busy fast by the time he arrived. And some wanted to continue exploring, but Brigham had decided that this would be the place that we would stay, which led eventually to the very famous, if you've lived in Utah, you know the story. Every time I have ever done the temple tour in Salt Lake City, you've probably heard the story this way too. Every time I've done the tour, the sweet little missionary girls that give me the tour always tell the story of Brigham Young standing on the top of the mountain where this is the place monument is now, and tapping his cane on the ground and saying, "This is the place. Here we will build a temple to our God." I've heard that over and over. That's just embedded in our culture here. Problem is, as far as we can tell, Brigham Young never actually said that or did that. That seems to have developed way, way later. And I don't want to disappoint you, but that he did make the decision that they were staying here, but there was no big dramatic, right? The story is told as if he came bursting into the valley and stopped and went, bam, right? This is it. And when in reality, he was the last one to get here. And they made the ultimate decision several days later. It wasn't this bold declaration. The closest we can get to that is Wilford Woodruff 30 years later. This is after Brigham had died and Woodruff had become the president of the church. At a Pioneer Day celebration in 1880, he was giving a speech in which he said that when he and Brigham pulled up on his wagon on July 23rd and overlooking it, that after pulling around where Brigham could see, that Brigham said, "This is the right place, drive on, keep going." And then in another speech in 1888, he said that Brigham had said, "Drive on down into the valley, this is our abiding place." Then in another speech in 1897, he said that Brigham had said, "That will do, drive on, this is the place." And so the reality is we have no way of knowing exactly what was said and when it was said, but it's certain that there was no dramatic moment where he declared this is the place. The closest account we have, or at least if he did, nobody recorded it at the time. Brigham didn't say anything. Woodruff, who kept incredibly detailed journals at the time, he didn't say anything about a moment like that. The closest account we have that's contemporary is by Levi Jackman's journal. He said this on July 28th, so 4 days later, and this is the meeting I was referring to a minute ago. He said they had a meeting 4 days after arriving, that the camp was called together to say where the city should be built. And after a number had spoken on the subject, a vote was called for and unanimously agreed that this was the spot. And after that, President Young said he knew that this was the place, and he knew it as soon as he came inside of it, and he had seen this very spot before. And so he's not even quoting Young there, just saying that Brigham affirmed that this was the place. And that's as close as we can get to Brigham actually saying something similar at the time, which he likely did. But it's just one of those things that's become more, it's a bit of folklore that has kind of developed on how it actually all went down. We tend to do that in time. If you've ever been to Boston, and anybody gone to Plymouth Rock? I hear it's very, very disappointing and not a very exciting rock. But there was never a dramatic Plymouth moment rock with them when they arrived there at the time either. And they didn't have that kind of dramatic moment coming into the valley. But they have finally made it. And they're finally here. But a couple things just to clarify about that initial journey. The saints did not wander aimlessly until Brigham decided Utah was going to be the spot where they would settle. And it was no grand moment where he just made the moment. This is where we're going to stay. They knew pretty much from when they left that this is where their goal was to come. It's amazing what they did, but they were not trailblazers. They traveled on the Oregon Trail and the Hastings Cutoff, both of which were known routes that other groups were already using. So they weren't trailblazers cutting a new trail through the wilderness. It was a known route that they traveled. When they settled here, they settled in territory that was, at the time, extreme northern Mexico. And which was their goal at the time, was to settle in a place outside of any kind of governmental authority where we can come and be our own people and do what we want. And even though it was Mexican territory at the time, it wasn't really under Mexican. It was so far north, There was no Mexican government in place in Utah at the time. But they were the first permanent European settlement in the Salt Lake area, but not in the area, because we saw Miles Goodyear beat them to it by a year and building Fort Buenaventura. And they didn't utilize hand carts. They did, just not in 1847. And that would come later. Over the next 20 years, 56,000 documented Latter-day Saints would migrate to Utah between 1847 and 1868. And that's the fascinating part of the story to me. We've got to the point the initial group is here, but how on earth do you get 50,000 more across all of that? And for some of them, they were starting a lot farther away than winter quarters. That became a stopping over place. For a lot of them, their starting point was England. They made it all the way from England all the way to Utah. And the organization of that group and the financing of that group is a fascinating story. And a lot of folklore has grown up around that too, the hardships of the trail. And it was brutally hard. I can't imagine walking 1,300 miles, pulling a handcart. That would be really, really tough. But the reality is, even though it was hard, it was fairly safe. 50,000, 56,000 would make that trip. Only 1,900 would die along the way on the trail, which sounds like a huge number until you realize that's less than 1% higher than just the mortality rate at the time. Which means if everybody just stayed where they were, about the same amount of people would have died, on average, with the given mortality rate. So it was incredibly brutal and incredibly difficult, but for the most part, they were able to do it safely in getting everybody here, which is amazing too. Which is where we'll pick up next week, where we go, okay, now we made it to Utah. What on earth do we do now? And we'll start looking at how was Salt Lake built, and more importantly, how did they get all of those people from here to there? And that will be a fascinating story, I think. We will pick up there next week. See you then. Have a good week.